Itzik, of course, no, Itzik is his brother, of course, I'm sorry. Danny, it's important for us that you hear this being said, that yesterday, I mean, you spoke about the fact that families of the hostages were not invited. Yesterday, Mirav Leshen Gonen, Romi's mother, was here, and today there will be Rachel Goldberg Pauline and with Ms. Hirsch. And I think I speak on behalf of us all, Danny, to say our hearts are with you. We believe the hostages will come home. We believe that a country that loves life cannot allow itself to not bring back these hostages. And now we will move on with the program, and we will have a session that focuses on the strategic struggle between the Iranian axis and Israel. Where are we heading? The Iranian issue, of course, is at our core. It's one of the security issues that are at the center of our agenda. And here we will hear from the very best experts to discuss this very important and core issue. I have the honor to invite to the stage Major General Amikam Norkin, former commander of the Israeli Air Force. Amikam, if you would. I have the honor to invite Sima, head of the Iran and Shia Axis program in the Institutional for National Security Studies, the INSS. I have the honor to invite Gideon, former head of the Israel Atomic Energy Commission.
I'm honored to invite Elliott Abrams, former Deputy Assistant to the U.S. President for Middle East Policy.
And as moderator, I have the honor to invite Segal, Chief Political Correspondent and Anchor in Channel 13 News, and from the Sammy Ofer School of Communications in Reichman University right here. Thank you all. Danny, you moved us so much with your words. We are with you. It's not just a human cause, a basic issue of humanity. It's also a strategic issue, and that's something that we have to talk about. There's a lot of basic assumptions here, and you talked about that. A lot of basic assumptions have been undermined recently since the 7th of October, and one of them is the Iranian threat. Rabin talked about this 30 years ago, Khomenism without Khomeini. For 30 years now, Israel has been trying to prevent the ability of Iran to become a nuclear power, but we are very close to that critical moment when it happens. The extreme Iranian threat has become palpable since also October 7, and we also have basic assumptions that we have to review in regards to indirect conflicts through proxies. There's also been a direct attack, the caution of Iran versus its boldness, the sanctions, meaning economic sanctions versus military threats. And what is the significance of a nuclear Iran? Will it be used directly, this power, against us and their enemies? Will it be combined with conventional warfare? Is it simply an insurance policy for the current regime? What can we do in order to stop it? And all of this we will try to discuss in the time that we have. I want to begin with a question, first of all, to all of our esteemed experts here. What do you think the situation is right now in regards to Iran's operations? They are a threshold state, a nuclear threshold state. When will they become a fully nuclear state and use it? What do you think the situation is? Thank you. First of all, far be it from me, as you've heard here on the stage, Danny, you made remarks that touch on everybody here in the hall, everybody outside here, and this is my first public appearance, by the way, since the beginning of the war, and we should talk as modestly as we can. And as somebody who has spent almost 4 decades now in the security forces, and it's in my DNA, security. I am embarrassed. I am ashamed. And my answers have to be in that vein, in that sentiment, because in recent years as well, first of all, as commander of the Israeli Air Force, but also in previous positions, we worked against the Iranian forces with the directive of the government that we cannot accept a nuclear run close to Israel, and that would mean Iranian bases, Iranian armaments, Iranian intelligence and operational capabilities that are close to us. And hundreds of operations and missions and assignments were done in order to prevent that. And what happened with Iran, apart, of course, from Iran's specific role in this campaign in Gaza and the multi-front battle the seven-front battle, I mean, the Air Force certainly has 7 fronts at the moment, is that what we see directly is the 13th of April as the key point of turning. We dealt with the direct attack, and in the terms of the Western world, it was unprecedented. I believe that we did so in a good way, maybe that even increases the frustration of October 7. And this action of over 100 missiles, ballistic missiles, cruiser missiles, and suicide drones, and sent to several areas simultaneously, I think that reflects the turning point that maybe this conference talks about in terms of our strategic outlook. That the situation that we were in previously changed. In my opinion, we are in a new day, a new reality. I want to make things a bit hard for you. Managed to prevent the missile attack of Iran. But the question is, the message is to Iran is, we can stop you, or was simply this a dry run for the Iranians trying to check our vulnerabilities so they can prepare for the next wave of attacks, which is more precise, more missiles, and will be able to reach targets that they previously now could not. Well, yes, first of all defensive operations, I'll say this simply, are less sexy, less attractive than assault and attack, let's call it that way. But professionally, militarily speaking, what happened at that night, was an event, a significant event, that we should, of course, discuss in terms of a threshold operation, in terms of our defensive capabilities. On our side as well, this is not something that you build and construct a plan in several hours. It takes years. It takes multi-tiered collaborations among the military, and building trust, and building operational capabilities, and building technological capabilities, increasing professionalism and expertise. And that's where we reached that point. So that I can say that on our side, but on the other side, and we cannot dismiss it, they also have reached professional and military abilities in this, and to create such an accurate, precise attack in such a precise window of time, targeting specific areas, this is unusual in the world. So I think that as processes go, you cannot go back. You cannot regress. What we see here now are things that will continue to challenge us, and greatly challenge us in the future. Even the interpretation and commentary on that night is different on both sides. We, of course, justifiably see it as a defensive success of Israel. They don't consider themselves as having failed. For them, for the Iranians, they don't see it as a failure. The Western world may have seen it, their attack, as a failure. But they are learning from their experience, and the challenge next time will be much, much greater. I go back, Gideon, to the question, and you are, of course, from the Israel Atomic Energy Commission. I'm going to tell you what we have, but let's ask what they have. How do we see what the Iranians have in their arsenal at the moment as a nuclear threshold state? What do you think is their interest in terms of nuclear power? Can they do it? Is it a question of decision? Are they already at that level of capability? What do you think is your assessment of their capabilities? We can hear, okay. Yes, just hold the mic. I think, right, it would be to define, yes, Iran as a threshold state, certainly. For nuclear power, you need also a fission power, you need launching power, and you need a vessel, you need missiles. There's no doubt that they have all of these things. They have, if they want to work tomorrow morning within a month, I think they have maybe 6, 7 such core systems that they can become nuclear armaments. Can they become a nuclear attack power? Yes. Our knowledge is from 2003. That's my personal knowledge. I hope that the intelligence agencies today have a lot more information than that. But in 2003, they stopped the program. And when they did back then, they knew a lot about nuclear power. They had a lot of help, outside help. They had Pakistani help, what they managed to catch and apprehend. They had volunteers that helped them. One of them was a Russian that helped them in the development of the warhead technology. And it's hard to assess where they are now. Even when they declared stopping the program or pausing the program in 2003, at the time they said there, and you look back at this archive that Israel managed to steal away, they said that some of their activities must be continued with all sorts of military universities, undercover and other kind of secret programs that they did continue to develop. So if you want to assess today what Iran has in their arsenal, even looking back in history, you can assume that from 2003 they advanced greatly, and they're not far from being fully a nuclear power. We can also see that there's some March last year, the last report, and we heard that they were weeks away from visible materials, and they are weeks away from being a fully nuclear power. I don't know if he regretted saying that in April, but that was back then. Now the next question is the missiles themselves. If that's going to be the way that they launch this. They are working industriously to promote their interest in that regard. I don't know if they have active nuclear warheads and the missiles to arm them with and launch them, but I suggest that we shouldn't assume that they stop their operations. And one must keep in mind that up until 2003, in October 2003, there was sanctions. There was a ban on Iran that didn't allow them to function in the free market and getting materials such as electronic materials necessary for their armaments program. But in 2023, the ban was over. The US continued. The Europeans also then continued. The rest of the world, I don't know. They can buy whatever they want. But the Shihab missiles at the moment, they don't have the transport power, the launching power, the organization required. Can they arm them? I can say very openly, I don't know. I don't know. We have to therefore address Iran as a threshold state. I believe the assessments that you hear occasionally that it'll take them 2 more years or whatever, that's irresponsible to say. They have visible material, they have material, it's difficult to know where they are. If you want to have a plan, any strategic planning, you have to take into consideration they are a threshold state. I mean, they can do it, it's a question of decision and plan. Yes, and it would take maybe months, I don't know, it's hard to assess more than that. Sima Shine. You're an INSS senior researcher, and you were head of the Iran and Shia Axis program. You know a lot about this. What would impact the Iranian decision? And if, in fact, they are fully capable, what would push them over the edge to make that final decision? Do they have a strategic decision here to be fully nuclear? Well, as has been said, they can do it. That's an important point, because if you can't do it, you can't make a decision, but they can. I would say 3 points. What are the lessons that Iranians take from the war of the last year, or the last few months, 8 months? Is the lesson that their deterrence is sufficient without nuclear power or not? And I believe that what the Iranians will take on as a takeaway lesson from this is that even with the proxies, all of their emissaries in the region, they haven't brought Israel to the point of stopping the war. It's not enough. It wasn't sufficient. That's one. Two, they attacked Israel, and as it's been explained, this is certainly a step that shows their capabilities and power. But the regional system led by CENTCOM, by Israel, by the US, and of course Israel itself, managed to stop them. That's the second point. Now, third, what Israel did to Iran. I don't want to expand on that point, but Israel has also proven, without making a lot of noise about it, that we have demonstrated to Iran a couple of key points to learn. Meaning the counterattack, for those of you who are less familiar, the strategic attack of Israel on specific systems and specific sites that were a point of precision, accuracy, and without basically an infiltration into their space. Yes, we understand this. The Iranians understand this. They're very proud, of course, of the fact that they managed to pull off an attack on Israel, the fact that they did this attack, and the fact that they managed to pull it off. But they also managed to fend off an infiltration in Israel. This helps them in terms of domestic propaganda. Israel is helpless. They can sell that. But that's very loud talking for their domestic populace. But specifically for Iran, it means that the regional defensive alliance, what they were so fearful of so many years, occurred. It demonstrated itself. It proved itself even without the Saudis. So for Iran, you have a couple of things that coalesce that may bring them to the decision that their deterrence is in fact insufficient, and maybe they need the ultimate deterrence, which is nuclear power. That would be the ultimate deterrent force against Israel and the US. So I wonder how this war that we're in the midst of would look with that, if Iran was fully nuclear. I assume that everybody would be a lot more cautious. Now, I'm not saying that Iran intends to go on a nuclear attack, but we understand that conventional armaments and a bolder use of conventional powers is something more possible if you're not under threat of a nuclear war. And I add to this two final important points. One, what's happening around the world on the global stage. Iran feels that it's part of that successful side. Russia, China, North Korea, this is after the war in Ukraine. So for the Iranians, the West are on the decline. They are part of the countries on the rise, and that increases their self-confidence. And again, finally, what about the leader that is in his final years of life, let's say, at least in terms of his chronological age, he's an older person. What would be his legacy that he leaves behind him? And when I connect all of the dots, I think that Iran decided, I don't know if it's going to do this tomorrow morning and rush to do it, but I think Iran has decided that they have to reach these nuclear capabilities to become a full nuclear power.
Can we do it alone? Where is the United States stands regarding Iran policy? Do the United States, does Washington sees the threat to the region with Iran holding a nuclear weapon? And what does it mean when the United States is saying yesterday at the UN that we will use all means to prevent Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon? Can we rely on that?
I think the answer is no one is certain. Following up on what Sima was saying, go back 10 years. The situation of Iran looked very different before the nuclear deal of 2015. We had a series of UN Security Council unanimous resolutions saying Iran cannot enrich uranium. China and Russia were voting with the US against Iran. 10 years later, of course, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea are in a kind of alliance, supplying each other with weapons. And the absent character is the United States. Yes, there has been one great move forward, which is the inclusion of Israel in CENTCOM, without which you would not on April 14th have had the coordinated defensive response. But the United States is largely standing on the sidelines, and I give the example of the Houthis, which is the Houthi partial closure of the Suez Canal is a use of Iranian conventional power, and the United States is not preventing it, and instead has watched it happen. So what is the United States going to do about this? I really think the question is without an answer. I think the Biden administration came in with an Iran policy, which was, let's go back to the 2015 deal, JCPOA. And for a year and a half, roughly, they pursued that policy. Iran didn't want to do it. That's 2 years ago. And for the last 2 years, there has been no Iran policy. The president said a couple of years ago, they will not get a nuclear weapon on my watch. And as you said, this was repeated. But if it's a military threat, it ought to be a much clearer threat. Maybe not public, maybe private. But if that's what it means, if you try to cross the threshold, we will attack. That has to be made much clearer to Iran, because I think if I were sitting in Tehran looking around, I would say I have had a terrific decade, and it doesn't look as if the United States has been willing to stop me.
But maybe we're in the what's called in basketball the money time, because we are 6 months before a U.S. election. We have the same old guys, okay, President Biden and President Trump. And in this period of time, there is a chance of a regional war. And when we hear the Joint Chief of Staff, Charles Brown, saying that maybe the United States will not be able to help Israel versus an attack from Hezbollah, what should we, Israel, make of that comment? That the United States abandoned Israel in this regional war?
The first thing to make of it is that he is no diplomat or strategist, because even if he believed it, it's a stupid thing to say. What does it mean about U.S. policy? I don't think it means anything, because I think if you think of a war between Israel and Hezbollah, day one, week 2, week 3, you try to play out what might the United States do. There was no playbook that said, you know what, after October 7th, the United States should move aircraft carriers into the Eastern Mediterranean. That was not written anywhere. It was a decision. And decisions would be made in the case of a conflict with Hezbollah. First, obviously, the resupply decision. Messages to Iran about staying out. But there is no plan about this, and I think that that's why it was really dangerous and foolish for Brown to suggest that there would be a lack of support.
בעקבות התשובה הזאת, אני רוצה לשאול אותך, אלוף במילואים עמיקם נורקין, האם ישראל יכולה לעשות את זה לבד?
Israel do this
זו שאלה שאנחנו
alone?
שואלים את עצמנו הרבה.
That's a question we asked a lot. There's a lot of question mark. There's an undermining in regards to thinking about Israeli capabilities. But the real question is, can Israel function alone against the Hezbollah? Can Israel be alone against the nuclear Iran program? Can we stand alone, in your opinion? Well, obviously, the answer is not a yes or no. Israel will always do everything in its capabilities to defend itself and protect itself and ensure its interests. And also in this case as well, Israel will continue to do so. But what I can say is when we look justifiably at the last 8 months, and let's zoom out, in recent years now, and 4 or 5 years back, from the agreement in 2016, or leaving the agreement later on, which is, again, another key moment in time. And we see what happened on the Israeli side of things. That just like the entire world, we dealt from 2020 with COVID, and then we had 5 election campaigns and instability, the result of which is an Israeli plan which is not organized and sufficient for this threat. So I think that we could have been in a much better situation than where we are in regards to the issues that you brought up. To a great degree, we are in a great delay. We're behind schedule. And the answer is not only just a question of some military parameter, there's also the economy, there's statesmanship, and I think Israel should have, I would put this, our strategic capabilities against Iran, which is comprised of many parameters that we would always like to lead in each one of these parameters. We should have a plan. And the public conflict of the Prime Minister against the American administration, against the armament supplies, is this necessary, or is this a strategic problem, and a strategic problem specifically with the Iranian threat on our door? Here as well, you have to understand what's behind the scenes, not only politically, diplomatically, but also in the sense of the use of the IDF in the scope of its, the attacks that it's, done in all fronts. We have worked very aggressively from the air, and in the places that we have operated, we've used quite a bit of, arms and weapons of different kinds. And I really have to, take off my hat in honor and thanks, and thank to our American colleagues from across the seas who have helped in all of this. So I go back to the original question, okay? The original question was the plan. I think we, of course, continue to need American help. We need it. We have to do everything in our power that we secure this help, because it has enormous strategic ramifications. So this statement from the Prime Minister, does it help or hinder? I'm not a politician. Okay. I go back to you now in regards to the public conflict with the Americans. As a person who is at the, knows about this, you talked about what can we do, but what can we really do in order to stop this Iranian advancement? What do you think we should do? What can we do? I think that's the most interesting, most vital question to answer, really, isn't it? If I look at what's possible, the first thing that's possible is something that almost happened. And it was within our grasp if we don't, we don't miss. And that is an alliance, let's call it a more Sunni alliance with the United States against Iran. That's the thing that most concerns Iran. That's on their agenda. And that could be a real deterrence against the threat. So you ask, what do we need to do? This is our first priority. I would make another remark that maybe sounds a bit weird. We are in a completely different world, a changing world. And when you reach these points, it causes crises, personal crises as well. But what I propose, I'm talking about Iran and not anything else, about Iran specifically. After you get through the emotional crisis, now you have to think what opportunities lie ahead, because that's the most important point. Even at the price that Israel allowed, just as the Saudis allow a civil nuclear program, and meaning an additional nuclear armament in the Middle East, that's a great question. Because if you allow a country like Iran to become a threshold state, then one of the first things you have to take into consideration is that it won't be the only state that moves in that direction in our region. For example, the Saudis, for example, Egypt, and no doubt Turkey is in that group. So some of the countries will take longer or shorter, they'll make a decision, it'll be a process, but the moment that you don't address Iran, that's what can happen, of course. But let's expand on this a moment, because I talked about opportunities, and now you gave me an opportunity to talk about opportunities. So, for example, if this happens, and as a result of one threshold state, there will be an additional threshold states in our region. We need to present that case convincingly and show that this is only the beginning of a process. The dominoes will fall. I mean, stopping the proliferation of nuclear powers and armaments, stopping it is in order to stop people reaching a point of nuclear hegemony. There are countries that in the past that didn't become nuclear powers, and now are on, getting closer to becoming threshold states. So this has ramifications. For example, Southeast Asia, South Korea, they had a nuclear military program that the Americans stopped. Even Taiwan had a plan. Japan, occasionally, before their foreign minister resigned this morning, he said the night before, it could be that maybe Japan also needs nuclear arms. So if we take this opportunity, maybe not directly, in order to explain that one threshold state will change the general balance of power, and maybe that will encourage China to pressure the Iranians not to move so fast. This is just one example of thinking. But in this case, again, I don't see any other address. The fact that we have a country here that is becoming a threshold state produces opportunities, even before it actually becomes, even before the Saudis become a nuclear threshold state. We can look at that, and this public contention with the Americans helps or hinders. Of course it hinders. And in the United States as well, by the way, the response of the US in regards to possibilities of an enrichment facility in Saudi Arabia shows that there's a kind of blind spot here. Or maybe they're not fully comprehending the situation. This has to be addressed, but more comprehensively, not only in regards to our regional situation. And one final point that, is an outcome of your question previously. Let's assume that we all fail and Iran becomes fully nuclear. What happens next? I think the answer is very uncertain. Nuclear arms, there have been in the world since the 1940s. It's been used twice, and it hasn't been used since. Not for moral reasons and not for, any fear or concern, but simply because countries were preserving their own interests. Nuclear power, using nuclear power, whatever country, in whatever condition, is a global shift. We all understand that. And the superpowers understand that, certainly. I think that there's a lot of, there are lots of things holding the system up. Will they continue to hold the system up and protect us? Who knows in the future? But we can assume that after an experience of so many years, that nuclear arms are usually or generally for deterrence. And if that is the case, then we're in a different situation. I would make one final point, which is interesting. The Iranians are very sophisticated, politically speaking. If I look at what's happening now, you can see that the Iranians are not exactly a threshold state yet, but they are advancing by threatening to become a threshold state. They are working with pre-deterrence tactics, And a year ago, now as well, there was, there were comments that were made, more bold comments from the Israel Atomic Energy Commission about Iranians' actions, and bolder comments. And every time there was a statement, Iran increased its non-civil nuclear program advancement, meaning they'd like to deter even before they're a threshold state. Sima, finally with you, and then Mr. Abrams, I'll turn to you again. In recent times, the leaders of Iran have been talking openly about the obliteration of the state of Israel, and we've already heard this several weeks ago from the Iranian leader. Do you believe that there is an Iranian program for the eradication of Israel, or it's just internal politics that's out of control? I think Iran always hoped that Israel would disappear. Not necessarily that they would do it themselves. They hoped that Israel would disappear. They've said so openly. Israel is an alien force for them in the Middle East and therefore should be gone. Okay. Does Iran have a plan for this? I don't know. Even if they have a plan, with all due respect, that's not what's going to change the situation regionally. But what is clear is that Iran sees what happened now as an intermediary step on the way to some future plan. This internal collapse, this internal weakness, this is something the Iranians are talking about openly. We don't have to guess. But I would say one thing that relates to what Gideon said in regards to what can be done. We published a position paper that was published in the Haaretz newspaper as well. I believe that Israel needs to sit down for a moment, forget Sinwar for just a moment, but sit down for a moment and think, what are the long-term strategic interests of Israel? And the long-term strategic interests of Israel is that Iran not become a nuclear power. So I don't think that killing 5 more Hamas agents and terrorists will change that. It's disproportional what's happening here versus a nuclear Iran. So even our relationship with the US and our ability to manage things collectively, and in regards to certain concessions, the Biden plan or the Israel plan, or whatever you want to call it, some kind of deal in which we get a significant US assurances, then the US have to say very overtly, if Iranian gets to 99% of nuclear power, we will stop it. But we won't achieve this unless we have an open dialogue, a strategic dialogue with the US, and it won't happen by making videos against the US.
There's a plan to destroy Israel. And, you know, Gideon Frank just mentioned how countries using nuclear weapons as a deterioration, and it was not involved since 1945. But if you have a direct threat on your existence from threshold states like Iran, should a state, maybe Israel, should consider using an unconventional weapon in order to deter this elimination threat?
I think it's impossible to know what the exact circumstances are to answer this question, but I want to make a related point. Having a massive arsenal of nuclear weapons did not save the Soviet Union, because the greatest problem of the Soviet Union was internal. The greatest problems of Iran are internal. The regime is hated by the majority of the population. And we collectively, the Europeans, the Americans, Israel, we do not have a plan to bring this regime down internally. We do not have a plan to build on those internal contradictions and come to a situation where it collapses internally. It's possible. Given the situation there, it is in a way much more vulnerable than the Soviet Union was. Well, what are we doing about it? Not much. A little broadcasting? Not much. This is, I think, the, let's say, medium-term way to confront the Iranian challenge. We should not assume this regime is eternal, or it will be. We should be working hard together now to come up with reasonable approaches for the collapse of this regime.
Should we go back to the regime change policy? Or?
Sure. The regime change policy, I would say, of Ronald Reagan. Regime change is a term that people don't like to use because they think it means war tomorrow morning. It didn't mean war for Reagan. It didn't mean war in the context of the Soviet Union. How could you not want regime change in, say, North Korea? Right. How could you not want regime change in Iran when the people of Iran want regime change? The question is, how do you get there without war? Okay. And this should not be beyond our capabilities.
So last remark, isn't the elimination of Hezbollah by the United States as a help to Israel is a good signal for Iran? It doesn't deal directly with Iran, but it signals that we're dealing with your forceful proxy in the region.
Hezbollah and the Houthis, yes, absolutely.
I could have elaborated with you for a long time. הייתי מרחיב איתכם הרבה מאוד זמן, יש לי עוד הרבה מאוד שאלות והרבה מאוד סוגיות. חלק מזה יהיה בשולחן עגול שיתקיים לאחר מכן. הזמן שלנו...
Some of it will be held in the round tables happening soon, but our time is up. Thank you so much to all our panelists. Thank you very much for having us.